It's Shabbat Teshuvah. And so I thought today I'd teach and we'd study a little bit about Teshuvah, appropriate timing for this topic. When I was in rabbinical school, one of the requirements for completion of the program of study was the writing of a master's thesis. Now, this requirement was only in effect for a certain number of years. They changed the completion requirements quite a bit. At the beginning, it was an exam on a bunch of pages of Talmud. Then for a brief period of time, there was a master's thesis. Apparently after that, it became a capstone course or something like that. But when I was becoming ordained, it was about choosing a topic for a master's thesis, and I chose the topic of Teshuvah. So we'll learn a little bit about Rambam's perspective. Okay, so Hilchot Teshuvah from Rambam's Mishneh Torah, that's the most authoritative guide to the Teshuvah process in Jewish tradition. In this work, Rambam pulls from Talmudic teachings to compose an integrated and comprehensive description of the Teshuvah process, and he introduces his text by saying, this whole text describes one mitzvah, that a sinner should repent before God and confess. That is to say, if you're doing the wrong thing in life, you should get back on the right path. A key principle of this work is that the process of Teshuvah is always available to people when they seek to atone for their sins. So in chapter 3, Rambam lists a bunch of severe sins and examples of people in Torah who committed these sins. Yet the chapter concludes by stating, when does the statement that these individuals do not have a portion in the world to come apply? Only when they die without having repented. However, if such a person repents from their wicked deeds and dies as a Baal Teshuvah, i.e. someone who has turned back from their evil ways and come to the right path, that person will merit the world to come, meaning things will be good for you after you die, if you believe in that sort of thing. For nothing can stand in the way of Teshuvah. Any wicked person who repents, either in an open, revealed manner or in private, will be accepted. So similarly, in chapter 4 of his work, Rambam lists and categorizes sins that are difficult for various reasons to abandon and do teshuvah. But the chapter concludes by stating, all of the above and similar transgressions, though they hold back teshuvah, they don't prevent it entirely. Should one of these people repent, that person will be a Baal Teshuvah and has a portion in the world to come. Now that being said, the power of teshuvah does have some limits. In chapter 6, Halacha 3, Rambam explains that a person may commit a great sin, or many sins, which result in God withholding permission for the person's teshuvah to be accepted. Rambam cites in his example from the Torah the case of Pharaoh. When the Torah says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, Rambam explains, this does not mean that Pharaoh lacked free will. Instead, it was Pharaoh who chose to sin against the Israelites. And as a result of the grave nature of this sin, God revoked the possibility of Pharaoh to make teshuvah. Ultimately, this limitation of the power of teshuvah can provide us with a degree of comfort. From those among us whose sins are too great, too drastic, this limitation on teshuvah provides a sense of fairness, an acknowledgement that the most evil among us will suffer the consequences of their actions. Yet for the rest of us, whose lies, theft, abuse are still grave sins, teshuvah still has the power to transform our lives. Pretty much all of us have the power to get back on the right path. God will be the ultimate judge of the merit of our teshuvah. Now, different types of wrongdoing. Rambam divides sins into two categories as they pertain to confession and forgiveness. One category is a sin between a person and God, and another is a sin between a person and another person. Sins between a human and God generally involve matters of ritual observance, like not praying 3 times every day or mixing meat and milk. But sins between one person and another are often violations of both Jewish law and secular law, like theft and slander. For Rambam, sins between humans and God need to be confessed before God, but it is not necessarily desirable to confess them in detail before other people. Also, these sins are forgiven by God on Yom Kippur, obviously, which is coming up. But sins between one person and another person, that's a different story. They need to be confessed before other people, and these sins are forgiven through a particular process of making restitution and asking forgiveness. So if you've been thinking that you need to atone for some wrongdoing in the past year, here's how to do it. So verbal confession of wrongdoing, that's the first action Rambam describes in Hilchot Teshuvah. He also states that a verbal confession without an internal resolution to abandon that behavior is ineffective. He doesn't elaborate on this point. It seems to him to almost go without saying. And confession is the first step towards teshuvah. when people sin and make teshuvah, they must confess their sin verbally. In section 2.5, Rambam says, it is a very praiseworthy for a person who repents to confess in public and make his sins known to others, revealing the transgressions he committed against his fellow human beings. He should tell them, though I sinned against so-and-so, committing these misdeeds as follows, behold, I repent, and express my regret. All who are prideful and conceal their sins, not revealing them, will not achieve complete teshuvah. Now, I think we got to moderate this at some point, right? You don't want to confess before everyone, but I think that there's a big difference between keeping it to yourself and making it acknowledged to another person. And this applies to sins between one human and another. In regards to sins between a human and God, revealing the details of one's transgressions is considered unnecessary and also arrogant by Rambam. These sins should be enumerated and confessed only before God, and in public only a general confession is necessary. Okay. Now, teshuvah is a process of change. So after Rambam discusses the process of confession, before he explains the protocol for asking forgiveness, he steps back to look at the big picture. What exactly is teshuvah and what does it look like? He explicitly asks and answers this in section 2. It's when a sinner abandons his sins and removes them from his thoughts, resolving in his heart never to commit them again. Similarly, he must regret the past. God, who knows hidden thoughts, must testify about him that he will never return to the sin again. He must verbally confess and state these matters that he resolved in his heart. Now, this is a description of significant and permanent internal change. Not only does the person have to abandon their old behaviors permanently, it's not just about the action, it's also about the thought. The person who did wrong must also view their past behavior not as glory days gone by, but as misguided and wrong. Instead of savoring memories of these experiences, the person must profoundly regret their actions. And so the final step in the Rambam's teshuvah process, we've talked about the verbal confession of sin. This is different from in the two different cases of between one human and another, where I think it's very important to acknowledge it at least out loud to the person that you did the wrong towards. And sins between a human and God, which can be kept a little bit more private, they're forgiven by God on Yom Kippur in a private way. Now, what about indications of teshuvah? How can you tell that teshuvah has happened? Now, Rambam's method clearly indicates that teshuvah is marked by God's testimony, but we don't have access to that testimony. So Rambam goes on to enumerate behaviors that could indicate teshuvah is taking place or has taken place. Yet he precedes this with a brief and rabbinically colorful comment. Confession without sincerity is akin to immersion in a mikveh while holding the carcass of an unkosher animal. Neither action will accomplish the intended effect. Rambam's language clearly indicates that the signs of teshuvah he's about to list are far from conclusive. So he states, among the paths of teshuvah is for the changed person to constantly cry out before God, weeping and entreating, giving charity as they are able, distancing themselves from the objects of their sin, changing their name to say, I'm a different person, I'm not the person who did these things, to change his actions entirely to be good and upright, and to travel in exile from his home, because exile brings atonement and humility. Okay, so is teshuvah, is this an ongoing process or is this an endpoint? Complete teshuvah versus ongoing process. So in this discussion defining teshuvah and listing some indications that teshuvah has taken place, Rambam articulates a concept of what's called complete teshuvah. And so this happens when a person confronts the same situation that caused them to do wrong in the first place, with the same potential to do wrong as the previous time, and refrain from wrongdoing, not because they fear the consequences, or not because they're physically unable now because they're older or something has changed, but instead because they have made teshuvah. That's what happens. That's what complete teshuvah is. When you have the opportunity to do the same thing wrong that you did last time, you're in the same type of situation, and instead you do something different, that's complete teshuvah. Now let's talk about forgiveness. As we learn each year in our high holiday machzor, we're going to be reading this a bunch of times next Shabbos, Yom Kippur atones for a variety of sins. For the case of sins between people and God, Yom Kippur atones, we've talked about that. But in the case of wrongdoing between people, Yom Kippur only atones if we repay and appease those we have wronged. Rambam describes this in detail in section 2.9. Even when people make financial restitution for their theft or damage, they must approach the people they have wronged and try to appease them, to apologize, to try to make things right. If there is no financial damage, or no damage at all, they must still approach the wronged party and try to appease them, because there's an emotional damage. In every case, the person who has done wrong must approach the injured party repeatedly and do their best to make things right. Now, thankfully, Rambam defines a very clear structure for asking forgiveness in the event that this initial approach is unsuccessful. If, after repeated attempts, the wronged party does not forgive, the person who committed the wrongdoing must bring 3 other people with them and again approach the injured party asking forgiveness. After 3 attempts, bringing 3 other people, it is considered officially the responsibility of the injured party to forgive, and if they do not, the person who did the wrong in the first place is cleared of their responsibility, and the injured party is now in the wrong. That's chapter 2, halacha 9. Rambam goes on to emphasize that it is forbidden to be cruel and refuse to be appeased. That it is the responsibility of the injured party to be easily pacified and hard to anger, granting forgiveness with a willing spirit, refraining from bearing a grudge or seeking revenge even when the wrongdoing is severe. In this way, Rambam pairs asking forgiveness with granting forgiveness, seeing these separate actions as 2 halves of one process. Now, Rambam also specifies 2 additional special processes for asking forgiveness. In the case of wrongdoing to a person who has died, the person should bring 10 friends to the wronged person's grave, confess the sins, and make monetary restitution to the person's heirs. Now, there's a different special case, where the identity of the wronged party is unknown. In that case, the person who did wrong should make monetary restitution and confess their sins to the court. For Rambam, confessing one's wrongdoing and making restitution are necessary even in these exceptional cases. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about free choice versus powerlessness. Rambam states very explicitly, section 5.1, free choice is granted to all people. If one decided to turn from the path of of evil to be good and righteous, the choice is theirs. Should a person desire to turn to the path of evil and be wicked, the choice is theirs. He goes on to emphasize his point repeatedly, arguing strongly against those who believe that people were created either righteous or wicked, and thus they are out of control of their behavior and its consequences. On the contrary, every individual is always responsible for their actions. And so what about a Baal Teshuvah? What about a person who used to do the wrong thing and has changed their way of living? Rambam understands that a person who has sinned and has made Teshuvah, a Baal Teshuvah, is actually at a higher spiritual level than a person who's never done anything wrong. Baalei Teshuvah might feel that their past sins distance them from the righteous, but their Teshuvah makes them beloved and desirable before their Creator as if they had never sinned. Further, because they've separated themselves from their sinful behavior, they've conquered their evil inclination, they've conquered their Yetzer Hara, and in that way, they are more righteous than those who have not sinned and have had no reason to conquer their evil inclination. Rambam also describes the manner of Baalei Teshuvah as very humble and modest, as compared to a person who has not sinned. He reminds us that it is wrongdoing itself to remind a Baal Teshuvah of their former deeds, but also says that if this happens to a Baal Teshuvah, they will rejoice knowing their Teshuvah is a merit for them. Baalei Teshuvah, as Rambam describes them, are special. Their sinful behavior has given them an opportunity to turn their lives around, to be masterful over their evil inclination, their dark side, in a way that people who have not sinned cannot be. Now, I don't imagine that very many of us in this room have a really dark side that we really need to atone for. But I imagine that almost all of us in this room could, look back on the past year and say, maybe I could have done this and that a little differently. So as we get ready for this last few days before Yom Kippur, let's remember that when we change our ways, it gives us a special power, that when we have mastery over our evil inclination, that we are not just loved more by God, we're able to understand those who do wrong because we relate to it personally. Shabbat Shalom.